Good afternoon. Bruce, it's great to talk with you for a few minutes today. And I wanted to have this discussion because you've been contributing this excellent series of articles to Truth Magazine for about the last year on the love of God. And they have been consistently excellent and edifying. And tell me what you were seeking to accomplish. What were the goals you had in mind in this series that is about to wrap up, but not completely finished?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Mark, to be able to write these articles and address some of these things in Truth Magazine. I really wanted to get to the heart of Calvinistic theology. And I think it's really important for people to understand there is what's known as classic Calvinism, which most of us are very familiar with. You think of that tulip theory we've all
Right.
seen, but there are also shades of Calvinism, what some call soft Calvinism. And really a lot of our religious friends, that's the version of Calvinism they tend to believe in. And it can really be persuasive on some level if we don't have a sound biblical understanding and knowledge. And so my hope was to show that just because somebody says this particular theology or teaching is defending the love and grace of God doesn't mean that it is. And to really contrast what the Bible teaches with the core element of Calvinism.
Right. And when you have done that so effectively, and I have benefited personally from the articles that you've written. So thank you very much for those.
Thank you. Thank you.
One thing that sort of stands out about your work over the years is you've engaged in lots of debates on a variety of topics with different individuals. And in the mind of some, debating is somehow viewed, with a big question mark or in a very critical light in our kinder and gentler age, so to speak. And yet Jesus, when he was engaged in his earthly ministry, on occasion, he came head on with error and confronted it directly. The scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, he didn't back away from controversy at all. And so, in this matter of Calvinism, you've been particularly focused on that in this series, but why is it important for us to militantly or with zeal earnestly contend for the faith? Why not just go easy?
Well, I appreciate that question too. Any form of teaching or instruction could be abused or misused. And so often it becomes very anecdotal. Somebody will say, well, I went to a debate and, had a bad experience. Well, I've listened to some sermons and had a bad experience.
Right.
So, I don't think it needs to be dismissed. And to your point, when we talk about approaching truth the way Jesus did, the way the apostles did, well, obviously they engaged in formal dialogue and discussion. And I think it can be a wonderful opportunity for evangelism because you'll have people that you don't normally have access to and be able to talk about these things. And so there is such a thing as honorable controversy. And that's what I've always tried to engage in. Now, there is the pressing of points of conviction. I think what you said, though, is important to recognize that in our culture, in our society, it's important for that not to overwhelm our sensibility of conscience toward the truth. And so when you can cross-examine one another and people can hear both sides instead of just one side, that's very, very important. And what I've found and what we've found, we've had a number of conversions from some debates regarding Calvinistic theology, because a lot of the times people may not pick up on a statement here or a statement there, but when they begin to see the consequences of a particular doctrine. And that's one thing in the column we've tried to do is get into these texts. We've dealt with Romans 7 and dealt with Romans 9 and these other key texts. And that's vital for us to do. And so what I would respond in some of these kinds of accusations or feelings that, oh, that's too harsh. I think if we handle ourselves as Christians, we can be convicted and compassionate. And debate gives an opportunity for people to hear both sides. So I actually think we're following in the footsteps of Jesus and the apostles when we have these kinds of opportunities.
And even if it didn't convince the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the people heard him gladly and they were amazed at his teaching and could clearly see the difference between the truth he was presenting and the distortions they were. Just as an aside, a couple of weeks ago, I was called to potential jury duty. And so I was spending a day in the courthouse over in Brazoria County, or down at the courthouse in Angleton. And it was interesting because as they were trying to come up with a jury pool, both the prosecutor and the defense spoke to us, but both sides were wanting a potential jury that would hear both sides of the story. And in fact, one of the attorneys went around the room and says, do you know what I mean when I do this? And it was that very point, is that, if you hear one side, oh, that sounds pretty good. But hearing both sides of a story, especially if they're in conflict with each other, helps you see with clarity the serious issues involved. And in the case that I was potentially called to try, it was involving a long-term prison sentence. A lot hung on the decision the jury would offer. And for us, there's an awful lot that hangs on our view of truth, is it not?
Right. I mean, we're talking about the eternal salvation of souls.
Right.
And so let's say somebody attends one of these discussions or debates, and they've only heard one side. And then they get to hear another side, and they see the scriptures that support that side. So that's the experience that I've had and that we've had as a congregation here that's been involved in these things where I am. And, if I had an opportunity, or anybody else had an opportunity to have a debate with someone who says there is no God, why wouldn't you take advantage of that opportunity? And the same is true of other types of religious error. And I want to say one more thing about that, Mark. And that is, keeping balance is really important. And so while on one side, if we never receive any encouragement, that's not a healthy situation. Right. But on the other side, if there's not really the kinds of substantive doctrinal instruction that equips Christians with the ability to share the gospel in an informed way, I don't think that's healthy either.
Exactly. You're about to shift gears on your column because you're reaching the end of this series on the love of God, and are about to give us a new focus. And you and I have talked together, and you have suggested, and I have concurred with the idea of a study on the book of Philippians. And that's exactly what you're saying here, is that there's a place for the deep theological study, and then there's a place, obviously, with the Apostle Paul writing Philippians, which does deal with doctrinal issues, but is somewhat of a different kind of book and different approach than, say, Galatians or Romans. What do you hope to accomplish in this upcoming series on Philippians as an expository study of that text?
There are a couple of things I hope will be beneficial to those who read that. First of all, the central theme of having the mind of Christ is something we all always want to pursue. And this idea of the joy of Christ not being based on circumstances, if we ever needed to hear that right now, would certainly, with our country and culture and society, that will be important, I think. But I think even going further, one of the things about expository study that I've always appreciated, as far as getting into the context of Scripture and really seeing the application in that, is simply that we let biblical teaching really drive our thinking and thoughts. Not that topical discussions don't also do that, but there's just something special, I think all of us would say, when we get involved in a contextual study like that. And so my hope is that it will be encouraging. But even in Philippians, even a book about joy, there's some warnings in there.
Yeah.
And so I hope we can kind of get that balance feel, but also be very encouraged in the Lord.
Exactly. And then the last thing I wanted to mention to you today is, in the February issue of Truth Magazine, we do have different themes as we go along, often two themes per, there's over a 3-month period, over a quarter. There are two focus themes and then an open issue. But the one for February is entitled Drifting Toward Denominationalism. And this sort of circles back to where we started on the dangers that are facing the church. And, with the people of God down through the ages, there has been over time, historically, with the Jews in the Old Testament and even the early church as we move into the 2nd and 3rd century, there's always that tendency to drift. And we're addressing that issue in the February issue of the magazine. You helped to contribute to the development of that thought. And I really feel like we have a good cross section of brethren that have contributed articles that deal with that theme. Again, share your thoughts on the danger of drifting, and especially from the standpoint of your work as both an evangelist, but also as an elder of the local church where you labor.
I think that when you consider a drifting process, as you mentioned, and as Paul or the writer of Hebrews talks about Hebrews chapter 2, I kind of showed my hand on that one, didn't I? But regardless, the writer of Hebrews is emphasizing it can be a very gradual process. And we've seen this in various generations, but when you haven't really seen it occur in your lifetime, and when you begin to have this and you're trying to figure this out, and things are being nuanced in a very kind of calculating way, and you're trying to read through all of that,
right?
It's important to recognize and acknowledge that I'm going to have to really be a discerning listener in this. And there can be consequences, and things can start out what seems to be small, but then it gets really big. And when we start talking about our approach to worship, our approach to the work of the local church, how we even understand scripture, the basic rules of communication being criticized, dismantling, local churches or really the authority of leadership in a healthy way, we're into really serious issues.
Right.
And I feel like this particular issue of Truth Magazine addresses not just the things that are very visible, but gets underneath concerns. There's some discussion about emotionalism, and we all want to serve God emotionally,
right.
But emotionalism is a different issue where I kind of check my brains in at the door and it all becomes about how I feel.
Right.
And that can be hard for some people to see through, but I think these articles are very, very beneficial in that way. And
I was really encouraged by the richness of the articles in this series, and I think it serves that need very effectively. And I appreciate your help in helping to think it through and to present it in such a way as to meet the current challenges that we face.
I agree.
It's been a pleasure working with you, and
you.
I appreciate so much your contributions in this regard and in the work that you do in Arkansas and elsewhere. But we're hoping to have you here in Alvin and maybe next year for a gospel meeting. At least that's the tentative plan. And so look forward to you coming to the Houston area as well, which you've been here several times in years past. Anything else you want to add before we finish?
Just one thing on that particular issue we were discussing that's in the February issue of Truth Magazine. I would encourage parents and elders, not just preachers, to take advantage of that information, because I think it will. I really do think it'll be helpful to them.
Yeah, I do too.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate
Thank you so much, Bruce. And I appreciate your work, and God bless you in all your endeavors.
You too.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.